Mercedes sells 58 EQCs in 6 months. Bob Lutz, right? This is Greg for Teslafaninsight. Thanks once again for joining us. If this is your first time, welcome. If you're a repeat visitor, welcome back. Our show today is kind of focused on the fact that Bob Lutz came out, wanted to thank our Patreon supporters as well as our subscribers. Your support is greatly appreciated. Also wanted to encourage you to like and subscribe if you enjoy the show. So today, it's kind of interesting because we're on our way to round 2 of our discussion of whether or not Model 3 would bankrupt a large number of the major auto companies, starting with people like VW, Daimler, and BMW, and then moving on across the globe. So what we came up with was the fact that it was just announced that Daimler had come out with their EQC line, and we'll leave this as a thumbnail where we have an image of their SUV. We're in sort of round 2 of what has been the response from the large auto companies. And what I mean by that is that in round 1, the theory was, why don't we just do compliance cars? People that might drive EVs don't make a lot of money and won't spend a lot of money on their vehicles, so there's no need to do something exorbitant. So hence the Chevy Bolt and the concept of sort of fitting in the middle to low end of the market with the product you put out. And obviously Tesla chose to do the opposite, which was to put out, really great performing, expensive cars. And it turns out that not only were the tree hugger folks willing to spend money, but people with a lot of money were interested in it as well. So the thrust of today's show is to kind of look at what's going on with this EQC and only selling 58 vehicles in 6 months. And then, what surrounds this, and what are the implications for the auto industry in general. So basically, as you know, Daimler came out with a vehicle it's only $67,000, but in Europe, when you add in all the taxes, etc., the vehicle is in that $125,000 to $150,000 range. And my European friends can confirm what the taxes would be on let's call it a $70,000 vehicle. So the vehicle has sort of standard for this round of Tesla response elements. It is an 80 gigawatt battery. It's slated to do 260 miles of range, but it actually gets about 200, consistent with the other vehicles in that class. And it is, I want to say, the sort of the standard process of response at this level, where the company will take a pre-existing SUV, drop the engine out, put the battery pack in, but there aren't a lot of other changes because the tooling process could be really expensive. And so they're trying to avoid that. And the way to do it is to sort of minimize the number of changes that you make to the structure of the vehicle. So this is actually a really good idea because you save money, you get a product out there quickly, and you don't have to do a lot of tooling. But on the flip side, it's kind of a bad idea because when you have things like a grille in front designed to cool off an ICE engine, the shape of the nose as well as the grille can actually lower your range for the vehicle. So, kind of good things, kind of bad things mixed into it. So the reason we chose to sort of bring it up today instead of our planned show, really, just to really look at how the Model 3 is a killer, is the fact that when the news hit that they only sold 58 vehicles, I was like, whoa, this is very strange for a bunch of reasons. Number one, when they initiated the vehicle in May, they stated that they were sold out through 2020, possibly, or through 2019, also sold out in 2020, and decided not to sell vehicles in the United States, because of the sellout situation they experienced in Europe. So then we follow up to find out. So another issue here that came up as we saw this was that why is it that the EQC, which looks exactly like its sister SUV from Mercedes, not enjoys similar sales, if low, that Audi was experiencing with their SUV? So Audi's selling, call it 500 to 1,000 vehicles a month globally, probably 500 in Europe. So we expected at minimum that this would be kind of the numbers that the Mercedes vehicle would start doing. And so so there's a bunch of questions out there, and obviously we plan on answering them to the best of our ability. One of the answers that came up is that it turns out that Mercedes is somewhat holding back in 2019 on sales of the EQC because Europe, as of 2020, heading into 2021, has increasingly punitive tariffs or fees on companies that don't provide offsets to their production of ICE vehicles, particularly large ICE vehicles, when it comes to pollution. So what happened is that there was a decision that had to be made by all the big auto companies as of last year, 2019, and that decision was, A, do you do what's called pooling, which is to put your sales together with Tesla's sales and therefore pay Tesla a fee, and that fee would be lower than what you'd have to pay to the authorities for not having EVs selling? Or B, do you just plan on selling your own EVs and hopefully sell enough to offset the number of high polluting vehicles that you're producing and selling? And in the case of Daimler, they had decided that they weren't going to pay Tesla and that they were going to concentrate their sales in a way that would eliminate the need for them to pay this offset fee for polluting. And so as a result, we end up with this interesting position where now they're announcing all these sellouts and pre-sold vehicles. Only 53 cars sell, but the strategy from what we can tell is to simply take the supposed 50,000 vehicles per year that they can produce and with their own batteries, shift them starting into 2020, and then work on adding other models. But the goal is to concentrate the number of vehicles sold in the proper time frame where it can have the most impact on reducing the hit they take from the EU/Germany in terms of fees that they get hit with. So what this then means is that Tesla, because of being able to deliver all these vehicles through the back door, was compelling the large institutions to set rules for how many vehicles need to be out there, et cetera. And those rules are starting to become a killer for manufacturers. In the case of Mercedes, they're actually taking it in two different ways. They're obviously a car manufacturer at the high end around the globe, but they also are 40% global in trucks. And it turns out that the EU has actually used the Tesla Semi as the model that that manufacturers in Germany or in Europe are going to have to do when it comes to their EVs. Both modifying the look, sort of profile of the vehicle to embody the aerodynamics of Tesla's vehicle, but also range, et cetera. So this is turning into a colossal nightmare because we thought that there'd just be a battle between Tesla and all these companies, but it turns out there's a battle between the EU, the large manufacturers in Europe, and Tesla. So in essence, the large manufacturers around the globe, yes, in the US as well as in Europe, are having what Napoleon would call a two-front war. And I'll remind you of the fact that in the case of Napoleon, he was basically trying to fight a war both on his eastern front against Russia and on his western front against England at the same time. And we all saw how that worked out. So typically you try not to fight a war on two fronts. But in this case, because of Tesla's success, they've created a war problem for their competitors, which is that they're now stuck in a situation where they're battling Tesla on one hand, but on the other hand, the EU is demanding, based on Tesla's success at delivering cars, similar performance from their, if you will, domestic manufacturers. And they haven't caught up yet, particularly on the battery technology, and therefore they're in a real stuck position. So we sort of brought up the discussion of Bob Lutz because he pointed out that by now, and heading into 2020 in particular, from about 20 manufacturers, there are going to be approximately 22 to 50 different vehicles coming onto the market. And all those vehicles would actually completely destroy Tesla, and therefore the Tesla dream would sort of end. And we're now in 2020 heading into 2021, and we obviously have seen that has not occurred. So the next thing we wanted to cover is we're entering an interesting period relative to the future of automobiles, and it involves there's a whole bunch of marketing concepts that lurk, and one of them is something called the network effect. So what that means is that if you have a product or service, and let's say it was your computer, what you'll notice is that right now, if a computer company enters and they have a piece of software they think is pretty good, and it could actually be better than what's on the market, the problem they run into is that there's a whole bunch of people who already are familiar with the computer they have, and number one. And number two, if they want to know or fix the problems they have to make it work, they can just talk to a friend and there's no issues. So that's called the network effect, where a friend down the street has a Tesla, or colleagues at work that have a Tesla, and everybody is really thrilled with their vehicles. And so now you have a point where even if you introduce something that's decent in the car range that competes with Tesla, you're kind of stuck because as a manufacturer, because yes, you could come up with a different look for the vehicle, but then you have the network effect of the fact that people already know the cars well. But then you add in things like, well, what about the fact that you have a supercharger network that they do not? And so when we look at this supercharger piece, you're then saying, oh, okay, so not only do I have the fact that my neighbors already have a vehicle, but I actually drive by the superchargers all the time. I read about them. I kind of know in general where they're at, versus competitors that are stuck all sharing the same charging facilities as others. There may be differing standards between charging facilities, et cetera. So it creates this further network effect where it's like, ask your neighbor, how does he charge up his vehicle? So you eliminate range anxiety from those neighbors because they're telling their friends about how they deal with range issues. So you don't have to generally go searching through a map to find out where within 200 miles you would charge up if it popped up that you needed it. You already have that figured out. And let's not even forget about places like Florida. We've had a couple of our viewers inform us that there are places in Florida where they're within 7 miles, either 2, 4, or 7 miles of superchargers. So then what about even places where you have high densities of superchargers? Now you have the problem of the fact that you're screwed another different way, which is they have got gas station level volume access to supercharger by Tesla. And for those people who bought the early cars, they have free fuel. And so, the last one I'll mention is that sort of the ICE comparison is that on average, Tesla vehicles are getting about 100 miles a gallon in equivalent. And so now you have the other issue of, hey, if oil prices rise a little bit or people don't want to deal with that issue, their net cost related to electricity use is a lot lower than what they were doing with their ICE. Forget about all the great performance, lower numbers of repairs, all the other attributes. So what we're looking at here is a situation where there's a growth in the volume of Tesla, and there are different angles as to which consumers are using to evaluate how they're going to do things. The last one that I wanted to sort of float through today is in Silicon Valley. There's a bunch of rules that the engineers operate by, but one of them you could discuss is something called the 5X rule. So the concept is that if in fact you have a product or service and and you want to bring that product or service out, you have to force the current solution in the customer hands out. And the minimum standard, and it should be higher, is a 5x differential between what the consumer is currently getting and what they might get service or quality-wise from the new entry. So a great example would be that I always give people is look at the difference between an iPad and a laptop. The key differential between the two when it first came out was a laptop would offer you an hour and a half worth of battery life, and there are a lot of international travelers, et cetera, that would actually carry a couple extra batteries so they could get some work done with an extended battery life. Well, what you'll recall is that when that iPad came out with 11 hours of battery life, that meant that people could get a whole bunch done on the iPad, and they weren't time restrained. So all of a sudden, all these people that had these perfectly functional laptops were saying, well, I'd like to bring that with me, and I'll probably bring it as an extra. But all of a sudden, iPads just swept through those areas. And in some certain subsets of areas, for example, within, I guess, 2 years of the iPad coming out, something like half the doctors in the country, at least the United States, had iPads because you couldn't carry a laptop between patient beds in order to record patient issues, but very easy to carry an iPad, and you had the long enough battery life to last through a whole day of seeing patients. So the question mark that comes up here is that as the new entrants enter, they're entering with perhaps 200 miles of range. They're entering without supercharging. There are all these elements of what they're bringing. They may be bringing a lower price, as in VW's IDE, but the problem that pops up is that there isn't enough that people can bring that hugely differentiates themselves, that isn't a competitive disadvantage with Tesla, that results in this mass exodus from folks that have been buying Teslas. And, forget about even all that and just talked about the first principles of physics that Elon Musk has talked about that he uses in a lot of his companies. And what that means is that you basically have a situation where as you think through best practices, part of the example is that Tesla deliberately chose to produce its own electricity or have the electricity available for customers under their control, because in essence they control the type and quality of fuel that their vehicles are getting, which other manufacturers can't say as they rely on others to deliver electricity to their vehicles. So this pot that we're stewing here basically suggests that the Bob Lutz anticipation of large numbers of customers leaving Tesla to roll over to large competitors entering is definitely a possibility. But the issue is Tesla's not leaving a lot of gaps for competitors to enter in. The one gap, and there is a legitimate gap there in terms of Tesla offering a low price SUV, is covered by the Y. And once that hits, and as Elon pointed out, it'll sell more than everything else combined. I think we see a real possibility that Tesla becomes one of a small number of companies that enters the realm of electric and sticks around long term because of all the variables we just discussed. So we now roll back to, okay, what's going on with the EQC and its entry into the marketplace? And the answer is, wow, there's a low sales number, but it was deliberately made low by the company in all likelihood. But that's still pretty ugly to only sell 58 vehicles. And as we enter 2020, we're going to see higher numbers of sales from those vehicles. But at the same time, it has some issues. Not that many people can afford a $150,000 vehicle. Not that many people that have that much money are interested, are necessarily interested in the challenges. I mean, right now we're in January. I really expect to see a very interesting situation happening, which I've been sort of waiting on for the last 3 months, which is in Norway or the northern countries, that northern half of the European map is selling a lot of, for example, e-trons. Same thing kind of in the United States, but it's lower, it's more in the southern states. But the question mark, like for Norway and some of these places where they're selling a lot of e-trons, is how are consumers going to deal with that 60 miles of range? Because if you're below zero and the battery has to warm itself up to approximately what we call, it's 33 degrees is the freezing point in the United States, but it's different in the Celsius category. So when that battery has to warm itself up to work, you're giving up half of your range. And if you started with 200 miles and then you give up half your range, you're now at 100 miles. Now, if you turn the heater on in your car and your radio and maybe your wipers, you're now giving up another 20, 30 miles of range there. So in theory, if you're very wealthy and you do very short distances, perfect vehicle, no big deal. But if you're in a very cold climate and you actually might need range and you don't have superchargers available, I think this is where you're going to have the separation from the men and the boys. So I think it'll be, this is all going to be interesting. I'm kind of stunned by the EQC sales. Looking forward to seeing how the new numbers driven by compliance being met affect, what's being done. And so, so at any rate, we're at the 20-minute point for now, and we typically take questions. I did glance at a question there of, what manufacturer seems to be, the most competitive. I actually think that VW Audi is actually doing the best job so far in terms of a range of vehicles that embody the performance plan that Tesla has, even if they don't have the battery technology to support being an effective responder to Tesla right now. So, between the Taycan as well as the e-tron, and then we'd expect to see, the IDE, I believe it is, on the VW side. They're definitely trying. They're bringing out cars that are not quite there, but once they give them a year or two with the battery changes, and they should really be able to mount a credible response to Tesla, which they can't currently. So, usually we like to wrap things in a bow at the end, and frankly, the entertaining part of this whole thing is that it's kind of weird to have people with, call it $50 billion on the table they could spend. And usually you can just take your money, and any small competitor that shows up, you can just grab that stack of cash and hit that small competitor over the head with it, with innovation or number of factories or all these other methods. And you can end up in the opposite. So the final theory I wanted to mention is there's a guy named MC Hammer who's a rapper who was really successful in the United States. And he had an artist named BNGB. And BNGB was very good looking, but just an okay rapper. And there was this process that they went through where it turns out that between the advertising and promotional work they did for her, everybody that bought the album that she put out, they could have given it out for free and skipped the pay from it because they had spent so much money. And so what we're intrigued by is that Daimler has done a lot of advertising, et cetera, to support the success of the EQC. And when you only sell 58 vehicles, you could have skipped the marketing, given away free cars to all the 58 people who bought it, and just been like, hey, let's call it a day. So I just thought that was kind of an interesting circumstance. So, at any rate, I wanted to, I appreciate comments and questions posed. We're going to go ahead and sort of post the more interesting ones on the bottom so folks that weren't here live can actually benefit from that conversation. I also wanted to encourage you guys to drop us a note on items you think we should take a look at going forward. And, we're happy to do some research and get responses. We actually have some really good production on China that we did, and having all kinds of problems with computers and getting it out there. So we do have some really cool shows coming up, including an anticipation of the numbers that we think we're going to see from China going forward. Kind of as a footnote, there's something we just did a show on it, and the discussion was focused on the fact that Tesla has announced that at the end of December they just started producing packs when it comes to a portion, perhaps not all of the vehicles that are produced in the Shanghai facility now are generating from those packs. You could argue that all they're doing is putting together the batteries that are produced by Panasonic, but we're inclined to just say they're putting together batteries and the packs. So they're doing the whole pack based on what they stated. And it's pretty exciting if in fact they're doing this, and we're going to get the answer to this. So I've gotten notes from you guys saying, oh no, of course they aren't producing the batteries. And based on the 30% cost coming from China component that we just discussed, the aroma is that they're actually producing the batteries there, and nobody knows for sure until they tell us. But we actually think that that is actually happening. And if that's the case, it's really exciting because it opens up a lane for, a large number of vehicles to be produced because they're not constrained by the battery production coming out of, coming out. There's been all these discussions about LG and CATL being the manufacturer there, and that's actually possible. At this point, I'm happy to see the production happening there, because if China's need for batteries is taken away, it increases the chance we could see the Semi and the Roadster appear, because they suck up a lot of batteries, and if they're going to China, you can't use them in those vehicles in the US. So the discussion has been, is it CATL, is it LG? We've argued that it can't be LG, because why wouldn't LG offer the same technology to their other customers that they offer from Tesla? And LG's already got battery shortages because they have so many customers that they're meeting the needs of. So it's entirely possible, but we don't think it's likely. We actually think Tesla has initiated their own production, and they're sourcing those materials in China as much as possible to reduce cost. So again, these are mysteries that are going to be solved that nobody has the definitive answer to, but it's exciting to see what Tesla is doing process-wise relative to them. Any rate, let's see. There's a question about what is the chance, Mark asked about the chance of a second Gigafactory. Mark, as I've stated in other shows we've done, I think there's a high likelihood that in the next, so basically Tesla's going to announce in February how many people are on the waiting list for the Chinese produced Model 3 at 42K, which is way better deal than the 63K that they have to pay for the performance models. So if the numbers are as large as we think, especially with the Y arriving, we think that there's going to be new construction beginning on another Gigafactory in China sometime in the summer. And that's all driven by how smoothly everything goes now, and there's no gotcha or hiccups that occur, because, we think, there's going to be a landslide to get Tesla. So, any rate, yeah, I agree with you, Graham. That's pretty mind-boggling news for Tesla to be producing its own there. And man, it even brings up the question of, if the Chinese batteries work well, might Tesla actually increase its Chinese production enough to start sneaking into global production and therefore reduce the reliance on what they were doing with Panasonic. It's actually good business, though, even though they're good friends, to diversify your supplier base in case there are any issues. So I think it's a good idea that Tesla is actually producing batteries right now out of that factory. At any rate, wanted to thank all of you for taking time out to join us. Please remember to like and subscribe. We'd also use help on Patreon if you would, and we do have our PayPal info there if you want to support the channel in that regard. Our goal right now is really to change up our camera technology, etc., and definitely could use your assistance in that regard. Have a great day. Bye for now. And we look forward to your comments post-show. Have a great day. Bye.